Authenticity. It's a word that means a lot to a lot of us. And it's a word that has a lot of baggage and weight, and that we really want to be authentic. But should we? And to what extent? Is it a problem to be authentic sometimes? We'll look at that coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing. So we'll often hear words like self-actualization, our authentic self, or discovering ourselves, self-discovery. These are terms that are thrown around all the time in spiritual contexts, in philosophical contexts, in psychological contexts. To what extent are they useful? And of course, there's going to be a range of issues here, and I'm only going to touch on a small, tiny little part of that range. But I want to raise some issues here, which I think are not often raised. And they came to me, I've been mulling over these kinds of issues for a long time now, because there's been things about the notion of authenticity that I think are problematic. And there were a couple of recent articles about politics that sort of, spurred something in me. And so it's due to those articles that I decided to make the video. Talking about authenticity within public life or political life. And there's an article by Michael Gerson in the Washington Post, which I will try to link down below. It's probably paywalled. It's an article about basically the way an authentic self is used within a political discourse. And we talk about certain politicians being authentic, and by that we mean that they are sort of blunt, perhaps impatient, perhaps profane within their public speech, and that is an indication of their authenticity for at least some of their audience. And defenders of this kind of speech will say that it's liberating and refreshing to find politicians who are not inauthentic, but rather who are authentically telling you what they really believe, rather than covering it up beneath some kind of veneer, political veneer, which we often claim not to like. And Michelle Goldberg, in a similar article in the New York Times, which I'll also link down below and also is paywalled, but maybe you can see them if you have free, a number of free articles this month, whatever. She talks about the same kind of topic when, with regard to, in particular, women in politics, and that women in politics are often judged by a double standard, whereas men are allowed to be profane and loudmouthed in public. If women are profane or loudmouthed, they're looked down upon. And at the same time, if women are not allowed to be profane and loudmouthed, oftentimes they come across, or at least described as, being inauthentic, being phony. And so the notion of phoniness is a kind of the flip side of being authentic. And so we have this issue with both sides in politics. We have the authentic, we have the phony. Ordinarily, at least with that kind of rhetorical spin on things, you're going to say the authentic is, of course, better. But to what extent is that really the case? And of course, we're going to say, many of us are going to say, phoniness is bad, because if you know somebody's phony, then you can't necessarily trust them. Right? Because if they're covering up what they really think, well, they could be thinking anything. And so they're just saying it to make you happy. And maybe tomorrow they're going to decide something else makes you happy, or something else makes somebody else happy. And so they're going to go back on what they said. But what I would like to push back on a little bit here is that phoniness is one thing, and being not credible is another. We can play with these anyhow. What I would say, though, is that phoniness is a problem for all of us on a spiritual path, and we'll be getting into that here a bit. But basically, when I did an earlier video on what I called brittle metta, which I'll put a link to up here, brittle metta is the way in which some of us may pursue loving-kindness practice. Metta is another word for loving-kindness. Pursue a practice of loving-kindness, and yet not be completely loving and kind, which is true of virtually all of us. And what happens sometimes is that people can sort of force that loving kindness in a way that seems phony. And that when they get pushed by people, let's say, who are antagonistic to them, they can get in a position of being brittle, where they'll be loving and kind and loving and kind and loving and kind, and all of a sudden they'll blow up because, they've been pushed past this point of breakage. And I think we probably, if we haven't seen somebody like this, then we can at least imagine. And I think this is an example of phoniness, or at least a seeming example of phoniness. Of somebody not really behaving in accord with the way their actual psychology is set up. And we'll get back to this at the end. But Michael Gerson in the Washington Post makes a really interesting, I think, very deep kind of comparison here. He says that the difference between, or I should say the importance of authenticity reveals a kind of a distinction between two ethical paradigms. One of them he calls the classical one, and the other one the romantic one. The classical one is one that I'll read you a couple of paragraphs from his article, but it's classical in the sense of ancient Greece, but I would argue the Buddha held an exactly similar kind of view. And the romantic one is a slightly later idea. And so I'll read this. It's a little bit lengthy, but I think it's worth reading the whole thing because it gets at a lot of the issues. So he says, in any ethical system derived from Aristotle, human beings fulfill their nature by exercising their reason and habituating certain virtues, such as courage, temperance, honor, equanimity, truthfulness, justice, and friendship. I'm not sure that he had equanimity, Aristotle, but the Buddha certainly did. Authenticity, at least authenticity defined as congruence with your unformed self, is not on the list. In fact, this view of ethics requires a kind of virtuous hypocrisy, modeling ourselves on a moral example until, through action and habit, we come to embody that ideal. Ethical development is, in a certain way, theatrical. We play the role of someone we admire until we become someone worthy of admiration. But there is a rival tradition. In any ethical tradition derived from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that is a romantic tradition, authenticity is at the apex of the virtues. This view begins from the premise that man is born free but is everywhere in social chains. Being true to yourself and expressing yourself freely is seen as the chief requirement of a meaningful and happy life. In this system, the worst sin is hypocrisy, being untrue to your real self. Now, the Buddha's view of ethics is really entirely on all fours with the view of Aristotle that Michael Gerson talks about here. That is, for the Buddha, in early Buddhism, in the early Buddhist texts, we are in the position of, and he gives the metaphor of horses. We are like horses who are in the training for the king. We need to be given the bit and the bridle. We need to be told where to go. We need to be put on the right path. And oftentimes we will bridle against that. We will feel that it's not right for us. It doesn't feel right. We want to go out and run free in the plains. But over time, we take to the bit and bridle. We begin to understand and make our peace with the training that we're under, and the training begins to sink into our bones rather than being something that we simply understand intellectually. And at the end of this, we get to a position where we don't need the training anymore, where we're beyond training, in the Buddha's words. And that's where we don't need the bit and bridle anymore, we don't need the trainer, we can simply do things ourselves. But there's going to be that middle time, and that middle time may be very extensive, where we are uncomfortable, where we are not really doing things right, where we are, in Michael Gerson's terms, virtuous hypocrites, ethical hypocrites, if you like, because we are professing one thing, we're aiming towards one thing, while we're not really able to keep that up ourselves because we're still in training. We may even seem phony to some people, because again, we're still in training. We're not there yet. And of course, it isn't appealing to consider ourselves phony or to consider ourselves virtuous hypocrites, in Michael Gerson's terms. I mean, that's not appealing. But then on the other hand, the question is, the romantic notion of ethics, is that really ethics at all? Or is it simply a license to be licentious? Isn't it? Or is it simply a license to do what we want, whether or not it is ethical? Michael Gerson later on in the article says, it's not truly ethics, it's really ethical or moral laziness and cruelty rather than an ethical system. It's a system that allows us to be morally lazy and to justify that laziness under the banner of authenticity, because we're doing what we want to. We're sort of running around the way we want to run around and not worrying about the moral consequences or ethical consequences of our actions. And I think we can see this kind of approach to ethics and morality in the way that so many people seem to be, let's say, very cavalier about global warming, to take one example. People simply say, look, I don't feel right caring about global warming, and so I'm just going to do what I want to do. And why should any of us have to sacrifice for the greater good here? It's easier just to sort of think of things in as though global warming weren't true. And I think that's the kind of moral laziness we're talking about here. We have to ask ourselves to what extent being authentic is actually in our best interests. And there may be examples or ways of understanding authenticity in which it's not, in which in fact being authentic is really not a good idea. Again, depending on certain understandings of the word, there's going to be others, and here we'll get to one. There's this idea in later Buddhism, essentially that our mind is already authentically awakened, that our mind is luminous in the sense of being awakened already. I discussed the luminous mind in a prior video, which I'll put up here, but basically what the idea is that our mind is essentially luminous, that it's covered over by our faults and our problems and our greed, hatred, and ignorance, but underneath it all, our mind is an awakened mind. This is an idea that is captured in the notion of Tathagatagarbha, or Buddha nature, is sort of an idea in later Buddhism, that the Buddha is in all of us, that all of us are essentially awakened, and that if we can only get back to that essential awakened self, that we will overcome these apparent problems that we find around us that were only mind created, if you like. And this way of thinking of things, of course, completely turns the whole thing over, because it's not that we are, as it were, horses in training that have to learn something and through difficulty and all the rest, but rather we have to sort of unlearn all this kind of stuff that has been put on top of the luminous mind that's keeping it in darkness, if you like. And this is, of course, a powerful rhetorical framing device that reframes the whole thing in terms of authenticity in practice, so that our practice gets us back to something truly authentic, where the greed and hatred and ignorance are kind of an inauthentic part of the mind. And this is a way that it's used, that the notion of authenticity is used in a lot of contemporary Buddhist practice, both in the Mahayana and in contemporary Theravada, because both schools do have this idea within them of this kind of essentially luminous mind that's at the basis of all of our experience. So many people do find this a useful kind of approach, and if you find this kind of understanding of authenticity useful to your practice, then by all means go ahead and use it. I'm not trying to disabuse anyone of a practice they find useful and helpful. For me personally, I find it very confusing, which is why I don't use it. And I don't use it because in the early texts, the Buddha does not talk about the mind as being essentially anything. And while there is a metaphor used of a luminous mind, there's really no sense that the mind is essentially or permanently luminous, as though its luminosity goes back countless eons into the past, which is the way the Buddha understood the human person, at least understood as a stream of mental and physical events. Rather, it's probably more accurate to say that the human mind is, if anything, essentially delusive. That is, that the greed and hatred and ignorance are the things that go back into the past. They are what gets us reborn all the time. And it's through the training that we are able to unsee that we're able to undo all that material by seeing through it. So for early Buddhism, looking for an essential character to the mind is simply ignorance. There is no essential character to the mind. And that was to contrast, the Buddha contrasted his own view with that of the Brahmins of his time, whose practice really was to look for the inherent character of their mind, their essential nature of mind, and to discover that mind was permanent and luminous and joyful and the equivalent and identical to Brahman. That was the sort of Brahminic view. For the Buddha, the mind was no self. There was no essential character there. And so for the Buddha, if anything, to be true to yourself would, in ordinary parlance, simply mean, to act out on greed, hatred, and ignorance in the way that Michael Gerson talks about, the sort of romantic idea of authenticity being a kind of a license to moral laziness. And clearly that's not the sort of thing the Buddha would have had in mind. That's clearly not the sort of thing that we should have in mind going forward. But going forward, and I think this is the most important thing for our practice, as Michael Gerson suggests with Aristotle, is that having a moral example in mind can be very useful to our practice. Having some idea of where we're going, some idea of what we want to do, some idea of how we can get better in certain respects, whether that be looking towards Aristotle or Socrates or the Buddha or the Dalai Lama or whoever it might be, Martin Luther King, many moral examples we can come up with. And thinking of them as, whether we think of them as perfected beings or whether we simply think of them as somehow a little farther along the path than we are, it's a way of moving ourselves forward. Of course, the problem here with any of our practice is going to be one of spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is the idea, the tendency that many of us have to, let's say, egoism. That is, to think we're farther along than we really are. When something bad happens, our tendency may be to freeze up about it and think, oh, that's not affecting me because I'm so spiritually advanced. When in fact what we're doing is reacting very strongly, negatively against something, and that not being a healthy way actually to interact with it. Let's say hatred arises within us, and we say, "Oh, I'm too advanced for that hatred, so I'm not feeling that at all." Well, you may not be feeling it, but only because you're pushing it down. It may really be there underneath, and that can lead to brittle metta, which I talked about, which I mentioned before in this video. And in general, it leads to what's called spiritual bypassing, and that, of course, is a classic way that we may seem phony to others. We may, in fact, be phony, and in a way in which phoniness, of course, is not good. It may not be good for many reasons, but one of the reasons may be that we're actually not interacting in ways that we really should be. So there's a way in which, of course, being authentic is important. That is to say, being authentic to where we are in the path and understanding that, and being at peace with that, at least so far as we are now. In other words, we're at peace with the fact that we're having hatred and we're having greed. We're being delusive at times, deluded at times, and being at peace with that while we understand that we have a goal that we're trying to reach. And I think if we can hold that all in mind, we may be able to overcome this distinction to some degree, get over the worst parts of the sort of moral laziness, because we're still striving towards a legitimate goal that's ahead of us, while at the same time respecting the idea of authenticity by being authentic to our place along that path, rather than trying to respect authenticity by saying, anything goes and my authenticity just allows me to do whatever I want to, which is the way some people have been using the word in contemporary politics, or at least using the concept in contemporary politics under Michael Gerson's understanding, and as well Michelle Goldberg's. And again, there are reasons why authenticity can be useful, because it gives us a window into a politician's true heart, insofar as there is such a thing, and we may even doubt whether that's actually true of any of us. So I hope we've at least scratched the surface here. You know the deal. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Consider subscribing, check out Patreon if you'd like to help out the channel, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, be well.